Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 100 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. It is hard to believe that when I started this chapter of my life a couple of years ago, that in what seems like no time, I would be releasing episode 100. Quite the milestone, and one I wish to thank all of you for being a part of with me. And for this milestone episode, I am bringing you all not one, but two great guests. In fact, they have a podcast of their own over in Ireland, which you're going to hear all about. I am speaking, of course, about Timmy Long and James Leonard, host of the Norries podcast. The Norries podcast is produced in Cork, Ireland, and I encourage all of you to listen and subscribe. Timmy and James are going to talk with me today about each of their journeys in and out of criminality and struggles with addiction to their lives now, centered on giving back to the community. Please enjoy my conversation with Timothy Long and James Leonard, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, gentlemen. So glad to have you here. Why don't we start off by each of you telling the audience a little bit about yourselves, your backgrounds, and the journeys that you've been on, which have led us to this point.
Right, I'll start. So my name is Timmy Long. I come from a small area of Cork City, which is called Knocknaheeny, Churchfield area. And I grew up in a family home where there was a single parent and there was a lot of evident mental health issues within the home. And there would have been a lot of violence within the family home as well, and a lot of growing up fast for a young child. You know, there was no healthy teachings for that child to go on and become an adult that was able to go through life without any difficulties or adversities with alcohol and drugs and stuff. So growing up, I would have been a normal kind of just young lad. I would have been introverted. I would have been very quiet, caught up in my own head a lot. I kept to myself. I would have been shy for a bit. You know, I was bullied on the streets and I was just full of absolute fear. My mother was our main caregiver in the home, but she suffered severely with her mental health, and there was really nobody for me to go to about any issue that was going on for me. You know, any issue that was going on in school or out in the street, nothing. So, as young as 10 to 11 years of age, when I was in primary school, which is year lower school, I think, I would have started to mess about with substances, petrol, gas, nail varnish, all these different things to get some form of high so I could get out of my head. And that was my first introduction to substances to take away all the mad stuff, you know, and I just rolled with that then. I kept going. Then I started getting into trouble. You know, and then I started getting a little bit of a reputation for myself. And a long story short, I went into my first treatment centre at the age of 15 for drugs, for alcohol and drugs. So I went to treatment there. I spent 6 to 7 months in the first treatment centre, and I went on to a second one then at the age of 16 for 2 years. I spent 2 years in that treatment centre. By this stage, I would have racked up a lot of convictions as well with the law, which would be the courts back in Ireland, and it was just all I knew. I always say, myself and James always say, all we ever knew growing up was crime, violence, antisocial behaviour, alcohol, drugs, prison. We knew nothing else. I had no aspirations to be anything else. I remember being a young kid wanting to be a professional footballer or a WWE wrestler. I also wanted to be Bruce Lee as well. I used to practice my Bruce Lee, my karate on my 2 younger brothers. So, and they have the scars as well to show from it. But yeah, I was a very, very introverted person. Even when I started getting involved in crime and going down the route of criminality, drug addiction, I knew deep down within my own soul, inside me, that what I was doing was wrong. But I had to keep up the image that I had, because I was afraid of being hurt and just being hurt again, because I was quite vulnerable. I was like a little child in a man's body at this time. And so during my whole 20s then, Joe, I like, even going back a small bit, school was never something that I ever got into. Never. I hated school with a passion, because I felt, when I was in school, I felt like I was dumb, stupid, not I was just thick. And I felt very very low on myself. So I hated going to school, because I couldn't focus either, and I had no attention within the school environment, because unbeknown to me back then, I would have had a learning difference, which is dyslexia. I found out that later on when I went into the education as a mature student. But I went through my 20s anyway, and drug addiction, a lot of violence, prison, hospitals on different occasions, mental health problems, complete in and out to doctors for different times. Just my mental health was gone, complete paranoia. Cocaine was my main drug of choice, and I would take large quantities of it with the hope of sometimes just not waking up from a binge, just that my life would be ended. It was just completely chaotic. There was no care for any other life, not just my own, but any other life. I was completely out of control, and it was absolutely crazy. And even though I was on this road to destruction of myself, I still had people in my life. I had my partner, Nicole, who's now my wife. We had a child when I was 25, and we had another child when I was 30. But those kids were safeguarded by my wife away from me and my behaviour. So anytime anything went wrong, like she would take the kids away, or she would get the guards, the police, for me to hand me home, because I was out of control. I was just one of these drunks or drug addicts that would completely. I was so compulsive, I could absolutely end up anywhere in any corner of the planet after a drinking and drug binge. I could do absolutely anything. I could wake up in any police station cell, not knowing what I've done before. Often woke up in white suits, forensic suits, because and they're scary moments for anybody to wake up in a white suit, not remembering the night before, and many occasions I would have thought that I would have murdered someone, from the night before, because I'd have a complete drug and drink blackout. But it just came to a standstill when I was about 20. I had a lot of crimes racked up at this stage, a lot of violent crimes and robberies and stuff. So when I was 31, I had my last drink and drug and gambling. I'm a compulsive gambler as well. And there's other stuff there as well, you know. There's addictions to sex and all these different things from back then, you know. But when I was 30, going on 30, I was 31, I had a spiritual experience inside a prison cell. And I was after being arrested again for another chaotic crime, a robbery. And I was brought back to the cells, and I had drugs planked within my body. You know, if anybody that has taken drugs before and they lived that life, they'd know when I basically had the drugs planked within me as a human being, not on me. And I went back to the cell after being arrested, and I was covered in pepper spray and all these different things. And all I wanted was for these police officers to just leave my cell so I could go back using more drugs. And by the time they left the cell, I tried to take the drugs out of my body, but I noticed they were gone. And I actually nearly had a breakdown inside the cell. And I got onto the floor of the prison cell and started trying to pick up white pieces of paint off the prison floor. And it was just like I had this just voice inside my head telling me, like, what are you doing? Like, you're going to prison now for a very, very long time. You won't see your kids. You won't see anybody anymore. You've just committed another violent crime where you'll get more jail again. And that was it. I got out of that prison cell 2 days later, and I went to my doctor, and he put me on antidepressants for depression. I was completely paranoid as well. I managed to get myself into treatment centre for 28 days. And after the 28 days, I was arrested and I went to prison for 5 years. And in prison, I kept up my recovery, and I also educated myself. I went to the prison school where I got an education. And I started at the lower, the bottom of the education system in Ireland, and I worked my way up. I went through what I needed to get into third level education. When I got out of prison, I went on and I done an honours degree in construction management. But all during that time, you know, there was a lot of different things happening. I was 9 months into my prison sentence. My mother took her own life by suicide in the family home. My other brothers were in prison as well. We were all in prison. Every one of us were in prison. I was in a prison in Portlaoise, in Portlaoise prison, the Midlands. I had another brother on the same landing as me, and we had another brother down in Cork prison. And my mother took her own life in the family home, and we were, you know, I was devastated really, because at the time I wasn't speaking to my mother, but you know, I didn't use drugs, I didn't drink, I kept going on my journey. You know, I was seeing the prison psychologist, the drug counsellor, everybody that I thought could help me. And that's when I found meditation inside in the prison as well. And meditation was it was my healer, it was my medication. It helped me to find awareness and be still, you know, and it changed my beliefs about me, because I had this core belief that I was just a really bad person because of the things that I suffered as a young child. Because of the stuff I was suffering as a young child, I believed I deserved it. I didn't understand that the people that were my main caregivers were actually very, very sick people, and they didn't understand their own actions. So I learned all these things after prison. You know, before I got educated, Joe, like, I would have never even filled out an application form. I literally never filled out anything. So yeah, like, in a nutshell, today, 10 and a half years away from alcohol and drugs, out of prison now, maybe 7 years. My life is good. You know, I have my own business at the moment. I'm a carpenter joiner by trade. I got my qualification for my trade after prison, and I got an education after prison. I went on to third level education. I was the first person in my family to ever go to college, and I still am. My brothers, who were both heroin addicts, they followed me into recovery. One guy now is nearly 4 years away from alcohol and drugs, and the other guy is starting again. He's trying his best. He's 3 weeks now, I think, away from alcohol and drugs. So I have a lot to be grateful for. I got a second chance, Joe. I got a real second chance, because when the road I was on, it was so destructive. Like, I could have easily took somebody's life, and that would just completely destroy me. When people get into recovery and they're absent from alcohol and drugs and other things that take over their lives, when we start feeling again, we get a conscience. We get a conscience about the things we've done. And that's a massive thing for me. And I'm very, very lucky that I never took somebody's life while I was in that lifestyle, because I actually don't think I'd be able to live my life in the way I am today, So that's basically it in a nutshell. Today, I have a good life. Everything is good. Myself and James, we have the podcast, and I just love it. I just love doing it. We clicked from day one, and it's just amazing the way things have transformed through the last 2 years. So I leave James jump in there now, Joe.
Yeah, I just want to jump in real quick before we hear from James. Timmy, myself and some colleagues are currently working on a trauma-informed desistance paradigm, which incorporates, again, not just the traditional approaches to reentry and reintegration, but really taking into account trauma. And what you just told me, it sort of validated that, yeah, we're on the right track here, because, again, it sounds like early in your life, not just early in your life, but there are a lot of folks who, as you said, were maybe struggling themselves, and there was a lot of trauma present. So that, again, sort of confirms that we really need to take in more of that trauma-informed lens. James, let's hear from you and your journey and what your pathways sound and look like.
Yeah, it's great. I'm after hearing Timmy 1,000 times before, but it's still very inspirational every time. Because I know Timmy. I know when he's talking about the context, and I know all this because we're from the same estate. And I was friends with his brothers, his younger brothers, and my mother was friends with his mother, and Timmy was in my brother Keith's class in school, so we had good connections with the family. So I know how bad it was, and to see the transformation in Timmy and his two brothers now is great, so it's great. I'm a few years younger than Timmy, and I always like to remind him when we do stuff like this. But yeah, Timmy's you're 4 or 5 years older than me, Timmy. So when you're today, it's nothing, but when you're small and you're younger, it is a lot. So Timmy would have been the older generation growing up, but we would have always looked up to Timmy, because Timmy was seen as he was always the man of the house. He was always he always had leadership qualities, and he was always big and strong. And we were Timmy had a bit of a reputation, and we were delighted he was from our estate, because we knew. But Timmy said earlier on, growing up, the role models you had, the role models for me was Timmy. My own father would have been involved in criminality, and other drug dealers and criminals in the area. These were the people that we looked up to. And there might be half of people to understand that, maybe not you, Joe, but because you're into the criminology sphere and you understand this, but the social context plays a lot of part, and it doesn't absolve you from any personal mistakes you've made, or any blame that we have. We've made bad decisions. We made bad choices that we had to own up to, and we had to make amends for, and continue to make amends. But the context where we were brought into, it's not like we had a wide range of choices. We had a fairly few shitty choices, and we picked maybe bad choices, but there were bad choices in a whole selection of bad choices, So we made rational choices within the constraints of a lot of shitty other rational choices. I think you might call it bonded rationality or something like that. But I was born in Dublin, but I was raised in Cork. My dad is from Dublin, Dublin is capital city of Ireland, obviously. Cork is the second city. So my mother is from Cork, and when we moved to Cork in the 1980s, in the midnight, I was born in 85. We moved to Cork in 86. And where me and Timmy grew up, I had a big reputation for joyriding, antisocial behaviour, drugs, addiction, crime, stuff like that. And the reason why that is because it's an area, it's a council area, a local authority area, kind of like what you might call a project in America, where poor working class people that can't afford to buy homes, they stick them all in here. Now, how that's supposed to work, Joe, is like for that to work, you have to have a certain number of private houses and then maybe 10-15% of social housing for it to work. But when you just stick all social housing projects, council, local authority housing together, you're going to get lots of people in there that don't work, lots of people in there that have mental health issues, lots of people in there are poor, lots of people in there have been traumatized, single mothers. And when you have all that in a densely populated small area, it's going to bring social problems. And what happened was, in the area where we grew up, because it's a lot of work, it's a working class area 100%. In the 1980s, there was a global recession, and we were hit bad with the recession. And all those working class people that worked in the likes of Fords, that we had a car manufacturer, Fords in Cork, and Dunlops that make the tyres. We had them in Cork. There was loads of other textiles in Cork. When the recession hit, they all left. So when you have a whole area of thousands of working class families, and now the industry has left the city, you have poverty. And out of poverty comes crime, deviant behaviour, and for others, it's like the hopelessness and the despair, the drugs then, and the alcohol and the medication, and where we're from in the main river in Cork is the River Lee. So our government health district is Cork North Lee. And Cork North Lee has the highest rate of prescribing antidepressants and benzodiazepines in the whole country. And when you think about it, really, Joe, it's like the medicalisation of poverty. Yeah. It's like we don't have anything else to give them. Just give them medication. Whatever about job opportunities or equal opportunities, or maybe like making the area a nicer place, or no, it's medication. And when you grow up then in an area where people either, go to crime, and not everybody in our area got involved in crime, but in relation to other areas, a huge percentage do. And the prison population we would be way overrepresented. Like in United States, famously or infamously, you have a huge population of non-whites make up the prison system. In Ireland, we don't have that racial thing, although we do when it comes to Irish travellers. Because Irish travellers make up less than 1% of the population, but nearly 30% of the prison population. But in Ireland, it's a class thing, so like the prison population is made up of people from local authority, council or project areas. Are all people born in those areas born criminals and born bad? No, they're not. It's a lot of it is you're born into a situation where you don't, as Timmy said, he didn't know anybody that went to university, and neither did I. Even when we were in school, university was never mentioned to you. The best thing you could do was do a trade. If you wanted to be a carpenter or a painter or a plumber, that was it. If you didn't want to do that, there was no other. It was social welfare, And I suppose for me growing up, I was always good in school, in primary school, I don't know what you call primary school in America, but the first, like up to the age of 12, I was good in school. I was good at English, history, geography, the academic kind of stuff I was good at that, and I was good in sports and all these things. But then I moved into secondary school, and the secondary school was a very strict school. It was a Christian Brothers college, and I was into soccer. But as I was saying, primary school was good, no problem. But in the home, there was lots of problems. My mother and father didn't get on. My dad was involved in criminality, as I said. My mother resented that lifestyle, so it caused a lot of conflict in the home. And you're waiting for it to kick off, or the next thing to kick off, and that kind of, it just breeds a bit of anxiety into you as a child, And when I went into secondary school, then my dad was after getting a 7-year sentence for drugs, and I found it very difficult to understand that and accept it, because like when you're a child, 7 years is a long time. When you're 12, you're thinking like 19, I'm going to be a man, I'm going to be finished school. It's a huge amount of time relative to when you're a child. And I found it very difficult to make the change from primary to secondary, coming into puberty, father in prison. Start to get psychological issues, low self-esteem, anxiety, dropped out of sports, and that academic ability I had, it's not that I lost it, I just wasn't able to sit still in school. I wasn't able to behave, and I was made to feel in that school like I was stupid or I was bad, and you'd be with labels like a thug and a skirt. These are the teachers used to call, you were bold, you were put outside the class, and there was obvious ability there, but for whatever reason I wasn't able to sit still, I wasn't able to retain the information. And when you think about it, like it was only years later when I went into education, I started, when I started studying criminology, I started reading literature around, the impact parental imprisonment has upon children, And then I began to identify a lot with the research, like problems in school for children that have imprisoned parents. It's not that I was a uniquely bold boy. My behaviour was very typical for the context I was coming from. And it wasn't that there was anything wrong with me. It was just there was a lot of hurt, there was a lot of other stuff going on. But the teachers, I don't know, I'm not saying the teachers were doing it out of badness, just out of ignorance, I think. And the supports weren't there. And I don't know, the support's still there for family members, because when, like, and Timmy will say this, because Timmy went to prison when he had children outside and his wife outside, So, like, when the person goes to prison, it's not just them that does the sentence, and it has to be up to the criminal justice system or the social services to provide a support, because when your father goes to prison or your loved one goes to prison, like, you start to get issues with authority. You all of a sudden, no, you don't want to listen to the teacher. You don't want to go to school. You don't want to go to sports and listen to the coach. You start giving cheek to the police, or you start resenting. You're going up to the visit, the blue uniform just signifies something that's negative, and then you have your backup, and it just sets you on a life trajectory. Then through your teens, like, yeah, I am from this area, and I have this stereotype and stigma from being from here. No, I know I'm going to live up to it because I'm being treated like this by the prison officer, and I'm being treated like this by the teacher, and so it almost becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're from that area, you're expected to be a drug user, and like I always say this, but I don't know what you call Marys in America, maybe a fun fair, where you have like the Ferris wheel and like the roller coasters and stuff like that. So we something like that in Cork every Easter used to come into another part of the city, and we used to get the bus over to the other part of the city. But because we were from this area, the people on the other side of the city are waiting for you with sticks and bars, thinking that you're coming for a fight. All we wanted to do was go on the Ferris wheel, but because you're from that area, you're expected to be like tough. They want to come off with weapons. It's just a fair because the stereotype, but like when you're a child, you're innocent, and even playing sports, going into other areas, playing sports, you're the child, you're innocent, and you're being called a junkie or a scumbag or, these things, like by not just other children on the pitch, but coaches and parents on the sideline. So all this negativity that's directed at you, whether it's in your family home, in your school, at the sports, in socialising in the city, it's no wonder then that young people, and like we have an issue with vandalism in the area where we grew up, mindless vandalism. But the reason is that the young people, they don't feel part of the mainstream. They don't feel like anything is achievable for them. They don't feel like that they have the opportunities to buy their own home or to go to college or have nice cars. So then they feel that they can vandalize other people's property because they have no connection to them. Their parents don't have those things. Our area doesn't have those nice things. So we can go into other areas and destroy them, and it's not about giving people excuses. It's just about trying to understand it a little bit, And people that commit terrible things, sometimes they're the nicest people, Joe. And like I've met people in prison, and Timmy has, and I'm teaching addiction studies course in the prison at the moment, and some in the class are doing life sentences, and some are doing short sentences, and everybody in between. But when you take people out of that negative environment of violence and poverty, mental health and addiction, and you give them a half a chance, then the true person will come up. It's like, I don't know if you're aware, in Sierra Leone, there's an international criminal court, and they try people in Sierra Leone for war crimes in the likes of the Congo, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, stuff like this. But like, let's say if you take the Rwandan genocide, for example, right? In the Rwandan genocide, you have the Hutus and the Tutsis, and it came to a case where people were so afraid of their neighbour that they went in and attacked before they were attacked. And there was terrible atrocities committed. But no one does. People were sentenced to prison, and then they're being interviewed, and then they go on afterwards, after reconciliation, go on to become pillars of the community. If you take them out of that violent situation, like, they're not maniacs. And the people that me and Timmy know, they're not maniacs. And that's why I think the one thing about Ireland in compared to America is, I'd say myself and Timmy would probably be lifed off in the United States for the stuff we did. But I think in Ireland there is an opportunity for all its flaws. Now, we're not perfect, but we don't get the sentences that they get in America. We don't have the 3 strikes rules. We don't have, like, we all seen the documentaries, black guy in prison for theft and he's doing 15 years, or somebody gets caught with an ounce of crack and he's doing 25 to life. That type of stuff. Like, there's light at the end of the tunnel for me and Timmy, and then there's an opportunity for us to, like, no history of education, to come out of prison and then to go through university, through public education, public funded education. So we're very blessed to be where we're from in one sense, but then obviously has its problems. But long story short, anyway, Joe, that's where I'm from.
No, I love long stories. That's what the podcast is all about. I wanted to jump in because you're throwing out so many great nuggets, but I didn't want to interrupt. When you were talking about just as kids trying to ride the Ferris wheel, I was thinking to myself, yes, labeling theory and stigmatization are alive and well. And finally, when you spoke about, the people you meet in prison and at their true self, they're not bad people. I often say, because one of my crusades is to get us out of this sort of us, them approach that we have with justice involved individuals. I often use an expression to folks when I speak or facilitate or train and say, okay, imagine the worst thing you did on the worst day of your life. And now let's turn that into an adjective, and we're going to label you that for the next 5 years or the next 10 years. You're a liar. You're a thief. You're a cheat. You're a whatever. But again, we have this tendency, at least in the United States, to take that, the date of their crime, we call it the date of offense over here. And that's how we define folks for the duration of their supervision, if not beyond.
Yeah. Imagine this. Think of it like this, Joe. Let's say if you were in school, Joe, and you played, I don't know, baseball or hockey or whatever you play over there, right? Let's say you're playing hockey because it's snowing over there. You're playing ice hockey, right? And you're 12 years of age and you're in a class with this guy, your friends. Next, he moves to another state, right? You never again now play ice hockey in your life. And you meet him, you're in your 50s or 60s, you bump into him. And he goes up to you, says, "Hi, Joe, how's the hockey going?" I was like, I was doing that years ago. Oh, no, but you were always into the hockey, and you're associated with something that you did years ago in your youth, It's like people have the ability to move away from sports, to move away from certain behaviours, to become different people,
We are going to talk all about your podcast, The Two Norries, in a moment. Just put a bow on again your sort of trajectories of where you've been and what you've come from. James, speak a little bit about your current role at Cool Mine and what you're doing there.
Yeah, I suppose to bring it up to speed, I ended up anyway in addiction for benzodiazepines and heroin, methadone, and ended up going into rehab in 2013. So I'm about 8 and a half years in recovery at the moment. And I wanted to go back helping others, like people helped me. So Shad Maruna calls it the wounded healer. So and another thing, you mentioned Fergus MacNeil. Fergus MacNeil writes about community supervision. But how me and Timmy reconnected in recovery was through community supervision. So I was doing a community service. So I got in lieu of a custodial sentence because I was after going through treatment and stuff. And Timmy was on a community return scheme, where he was able to finish the end of his sentence in the community. So, and that's where me and Timmy met. So I was doing one thing, he was doing the other. We were doing in the same area. So for all its flaws of community supervision and extending the carceral net wider, it's not bars, but it can work for some people. And sometimes allowing people to serve their sentence in the community can be the best thing for them because it's a little bit of a safety net. So that's the one thing. After a while, I ended up going through college and I did a bachelor's degree in social science, community work, and a master's in criminology. And now I work in the drug and alcohol services. So I'm the team leader of the project in my local city in Cork, and I have 6 or 7 staff there, and we provide group and one-to-one work. We provide different range of evidence-based treatments for not just the person that used the drug or alcohol, but for the family members too. And we have community support as well. And we support people into residential, but we're not residential. We're community-based projects, Yeah. So that's kind of it. And I feel very honoured and privileged to be in a place where I can actually paid to help people. Because to be honest, it's second nature for me, Joe, to help people like people help me.
Yeah, you mentioned our good friends Shad Maruna and Fergus McNeil, and they speak of, when they speak on the topic of desistance from crime, this notion of what they term generativity or giving back, which sounds exactly what you're an example of, James. There, this need amongst the wounded warriors, as you put it, to sort of give back and let others learn from their experiences. Timmy, you mentioned a little bit in your introduction about your educational and vocational milestones that you went through. And again, in the desistance literature, we talk about it in these sort of themes of changing your identity, changing your social capital, but also building up your human capital as far as, again, those skills and traits, education, employment, and maybe just, again, remind folks how that all, how you leveraged all of those experiences to end up where you're at now.
Basically, I had to go back into education to the beginning. I had to go right back to the beginning of education, start from the bottom, learn the alphabet, learn what a vowel was, learn what a noun was, all these different things. And little did I know at the time, I wasn't able to retain information at that time because I was in the prison setting, and it was in fight or flight. My body was pumping adrenaline at a constant rate for all my life. I was in fight or flight. I was so hypervigilant as a human being that my body never stepped below the fight or flight mode of life. I was just completely across. And when I hear people then talking about how they're anxious and they get panic attacks, I lived my life in that life. I lived in the complete panic attack, anxiety, but I didn't show it because I didn't know I was even feeling like that, because I was completely numb. I didn't even know what feelings and emotions were when I started on this journey. I had to learn. I hadn't a clue. I had not a clue. So I started with the education system, as I said, and I worked my way up in the prison. And when I got out of prison, then I started on another 6 years of education. And I wanted to stay in the construction route because I knew a little bit about it. And I wanted to continue on the road of something I knew, because there were so many people around me going down the route for social care and being a fitness trainer that were in recovery, early recovery from drugs and alcohol. And I just didn't want to. I wanted something different because it just didn't fit the glove for me at the time. So I went away and I got the education that I needed, and I went back and I got a qualification in carpentry and joinery, and I worked my way through education until 2020, May 2020. I graduated with an honours degree in construction management. And during that period in my last year of college, I would hear lecturers talking about the Garda vetting process, which is when you go working with a firm, you get vetted by the police, the Garda vetting in Ireland. And I used to get very, very stressed over it because I used to be thinking to myself, and then all these core beliefs that I was bad and you're no good and all the guilt and shame from the past would all come up the minute I'd hear one of these lecturers talking about the Garda vetting process. And I put myself into a really, really, really low place and a bad place. And that's when I just said to myself, do you know what? I'm not even going to try to get a job off somebody else. I'm just going to start my own company. I'm just going to go from there, And it's been a difficult road, if I'm going to be honest. It's very, very hard for me sometimes to function and to be balanced and stuff because of never being that way in my lifetime. And at the moment, I'm trying to instill some structures into my lifetime, into my life, around my family, around the podcast, around work. And I've made a really, really massive decision that I'm going to work and structure and balance in my life. Something that I never, ever had before. And thankfully, it's actually working, and I feel much better in myself because I've things structured on different days and times. And because for a while there, I was running around trying to fix everything, fix everyone, and I was struggling then. And James can relate to this as well because the two of us been pulled from pillar to post there in the last few months. And I was just completely burnt out. And, what happened from my education was I got an education where I was able to understand the effects of trauma in my own life and how it affected me being an adult, and how it affected me and how I went on to become addicted to alcohol and drugs and how I was so violent. Like, I grew up in a home of violence that was really, like, I don't talk about it very, very much in the podcast because it's not a place for it, but it was a really, really, really difficult place to be in, and like, I would have grown up then being really violent with alcohol and drugs in my system, and so today, Joe, like, I'm very blessed to own my own company, and I'm very blessed that I don't feel the way I did before 2 years ago, where I was full of fear and around people accepting me with criminal convictions. Now people ring my phone because they want me to go working for them, and that's because I came out and I started talking about my story on the podcast with James, and I didn't hide anything. I let people know this is who I am. This is what happened to me. This is why I was behaving the way I was. I don't behave like that today. I don't do anything like that today. And I suppose when people seeing that and they could see the past and how I was now, a lot of people would accept it. A lot of people accepted it and they opened their arms to me and they gave me opportunities. But listen, myself and James have been very, very fortunate to have some fantastic people in our lives. Both of us have very, very good women in our lives, our wives, and outside of that, we've had so many different inspirational role models in recovery as well from alcohol and drugs that really, really caught our hands when we needed it and helped us to cross the road and move on to the next step, because recovery is like going up a stairway, a never-ending stairway, because you're dealing with different things at different time, and there's no end place. It's just you have more peace within you and you're able to understand things a little bit easier because you're getting educated. And that's something I want to get back to there. Because I did get an education, I was able to understand me a lot more. I was able to understand life a lot more. But if I didn't get educated and understand words, the English language, I would have never, ever, ever understood what was going on for me, and that was the breaking point. And I try to emphasize that to anybody that I do speak to today that are in early recovery and they want to move on to the next step. And I just say, go to a class where you're able to just learn the basics of what you need and just slowly does it, because if you run too fast into it, you might fall and you mightn't get back up again. And I say that does happen. So yeah, that's my journey to construction into where I am today. And that was a little bit about the education. So I'm very, very blessed. I'm very blessed, Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing, Timmy. I really appreciate that. I know that isn't always easy. Let's shift gears and talk about your podcast, The Two Norries, as promised. James, what was the inspiration for launching your podcast? And for those who do not know, who are outside of Cork, perhaps, explain the title, The Two Norries, if you would.
So we're from the north side of Cork City, and colloquially here, you'd be known as a Norrie. So Norrie for north side. So when me and Timmy started the podcast, we felt it might be popular in our local area, so people would get it. But we find ourselves increasingly having to explain what a Norrie is to people from around Ireland and now in America. So we probably, with hindsight, should have named this something more generic. But
it's mysterious, so it makes people tune in for the mystery of what does that mean, the two Norries? But no, I love it. I know you cover topics related to crime, mental health, addiction, as well as social and health issues.
Yeah.
And I know you've been doing this for a while now. You're into the 90s with episodes. Are there certain themes you've noted over the course of the program?
Well, how it started out anyway was I was on the TV. I was on national TV 2 years ago, and I gave my story, and there was a huge response, and I was overwhelmed with the amount of people contacting me, and I spoke to Timmy about it. I said, Timmy, look, all these people looking for help and support and information and guidance and all the media requests I had. So Timmy says, why don't we do our own podcast, and then we can answer those questions and put it up on YouTube for free, and then that be the way of indirectly answering them. So then we said we get people like ourselves on, and then we get people like us, and then maybe academics and psychologists and services, and then it'd be like a hub of information for people, So that's how it came. That's how it was born. The themes, I suppose you said earlier on, Joe, trauma is the huge one. Like it's grown out of, like, there was myself and Timmy, and then we had, around the criminal justice system, but then people started contacting us. Will you cover eating disorders? Will you cover gambling? Will you cover domestic violence? Will you cover sexual assault? And will you cover all these? Will you cover ulcerative colitis, chronic illness? Will you cover how autoimmune conditions? And so it just became a social and health issue podcast. All right. But the core of it all, Joe, is trauma. And if you're in the podcast and you've been to prison, or if you're on the podcast you have an eating disorder, or if you're on the podcast and you have a chronic autoimmune condition, or if you're on the podcast and you've it's nearly all linked to something that's after happening to you. Abuses, neglects, violence, and it manifests itself in different ways. Like for me and Timmy, it was drugs. And for another guest, it was anorexia. Another guest, it was bulimia. Another guest, they didn't use substances, but they internalized it. I know they have a chronic condition, like an autoimmune condition, But at the crux of it all is people are traumatized, and people don't have the skills to deal with that trauma. So they use what's available to them. They try to control what they can. And sometimes it's food and sex and shopping and drugs, and So that's kind of the gist of it, really. Something that I've noticed over the last almost 2 years now.
What I will do for the listeners who are interested, I will leave a link for your podcast in the episode description of this program, so folks can just click on that, and I encourage them to subscribe. I should note that the first couple of episodes are really sort of a recap of your journeys, kind of what you've given us here on the show. We loved on this program talking about desistance and desistance from crime. And again, per the literature and what I've learned from my guests with lived experiences, is oftentimes when people reflect back on their criminal trajectories and those pathways into crime, addiction, and deviancies, as well as those pathways out. At some points, when they look back, they can see and point to specific turning points or milestones that sort of were a seminal point in their journey. Can either of you perhaps reflect back and say, yes, it was this educational program, or it was this prison officer, or it was this is what, again, served for me as a turning point, or sometimes I frame it almost like an off-ramp on the highway or an off-ramp on the freeway. Either of you want to take a stab at that?
For me, when I went to treatment, I came across a drug counsellor within it was a residential care treatment centre, and I came across a guy who was actually a counsellor within that setting, and I got talking to him, and he had a very similar story to me. He was a big guy, muscular, he had tattoos, he was in prison, he had a tough upbringing, and I was looking at him and I was saying, and now I was looking at him, and like he looked like he was happy, he looked like he had everything together, and I said, I actually want what this guy has here. But when I came out of that treatment centre, I went directly into prison. So while I was still in the prison setting for a few years after that, I was still in my recovery journey, and I was seeing a prison psychologist who was a massive, massive inspirational person in my life, who helped me massively to understand some of the issues that were going on for me, and to get over my mother's death as well while I was in the prison. But when I came out of the prison, then he left such a mark on me that when I came out, I asked him to be my sponsor, my AA sponsor. And I was able to go over the big book with him, and I was able to learn from him. And I was so blown away and inspired by him at the time, Joe, that if he told me to cross the road in front of a truck, I would have, because I wanted what he had. I wanted recovery. I wanted to live the life that he just looked like he was happy. You know, I was miserable at the time. I was going through an awful lot of shit within my life. You know, I was visiting a lot of trauma from my past, and I was dealing with a lot of guilt and shame and fear from everything going up. You know, I grew up in my family home. You know, when there's poor mental health with a family environment, and there's children growing up around it, you know, and they're young, and the parent is severely depressed, there's an effect on that child. There's a serious effect on that child, you know. And my mother was she lived her life consumed by shame, you know, and the only thing that I can understand why I feel so much fear and shame and guilt is because it was passed on to me. It's not because I done anything bad, you know. Like I may have hurt some people, but it's not like I murdered anybody or raped anybody or anything like that, you know. It's just something that's there, and it's something that I know I still have to work on, you know. But because of what my mother took her own life, okay, and because I felt really bad where there was no hope in my own life, I kind of understand what really pushed my mother to taking her own life by suicide, because I actually feel like I did feel that sense of no hope, that sense of how am I ever going to get out of this, you know. So I have a lot of kind of wisdom around that, around my mother's situation, like, and this is very, very important, and I think James, I know James definitely agrees with me here. When we as people come over the alcohol and drug addictions and gambling addictions, and we're starting to look at ourselves and look at our childhoods and why we drank and why we done this, the last thing you want to do is start taking out the blame game, you know, where you're going to blame this person or that person or whatever. You can have a look at what their input may have been on your life and how it may have affected you. But if you start playing the blame game, you'll get consumed in that and you'll miss your opportunity to grow and to flourish in recovery. So, like, I don't look at my childhood or any of these negative things that happened in my life as in things that, oh, I wish that didn't happen. I look at them now and I look at them as in parts of my journey that were set in stone, and they were there to make me stronger as a human being, because there's some things that have happened in my life I don't really even understand or know how I even got through them or how I'm sitting here in this chair talking to the two of you. So I definitely went off on a tangent there anyway, so I don't even know what the question was, so sorry.
I love your tangents. I was going to say, obviously the listeners don't know this, but we're doing this with the aid of a video connection, and you at least the two of you see the bookshelf behind me. And as you were speaking to me, I thought, I have read all these textbooks on criminology and research articles, but I mean, truly speaking to folks like you, it's just infinitely more value added to get that authentic perspective. Also, as you were speaking about the role of trauma, and the more I learn about the role of trauma, I've taken to stealing an expression I heard from somebody recently, in which it speaks to the way that we view justice involved individuals, and we need to change the question from what's wrong with that person to what happened to that person.
Another way of framing it, Joe, would be in terms of criminal justice system, like we're talking about, would be hurt people hurt people.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another big misnomer that people have, is that, again, they fall into this sort of binary us and them, and they don't realize, most people in prisons are victims themselves. It's not this, black hats, white hats, hurt people. I love that. I'm going to steal that as well, James. James, from your lens, what is the field of corrections, probation, parole doing right? And conversely, where do you see some room for growth?
So I don't know what way it is in your area where you're living in Minneapolis or Minnesota, but in Ireland, all our services are state-run. I don't know. I know some America's privatized, some isn't. So what way is it over by you?
No, we have experimented with the privatization, but it's all state-run.
Okay. Well, that's a good thing, because when stuff becomes for profit, it just doesn't work. And if you look at the UK have a probation service that was outsourced to a private company, and it just is not fit for purpose. And you could see some documentaries on YouTube about where, people's lives are on the line, and the probation officer just couldn't be bothered turning up on the day, In Ireland, we have a good system in terms of, like, everything is state-run. So when you have something that's state-run, you have proper trained staff with proper salaries and, pensionable, so you have good quality workers, What's doing right at the moment, I can speak for, not for the prison service, but like my association with the prison service. So the Irish prison service is trying to move away from the old them and us mentality, and like the way it is now, like, is if a person commits a crime and then they go before the court, either in the district court or in the circuit court, they go before a judge or they go before a jury. Either way, they'll get punished there and they'll get sentenced and they get their judgment there. Then when they come to prison, they're not in prison to be judged at all. They're in prison because they have been judged, and your job as a prison officer is to facilitate and carry out the judgment, not to compound it with more judgments and more punishments, So I think the Irish Prison Service has that mentality now, and they're trying to. There's a big recruitment going on for the last 4 or 5 years, and I've been a part of, myself and Sheila Connolly from the Cork Alliance Centre. Would be a great guest for you, Joe, actually. That's an NGO based in our home city, and they support people pre and post release from prison. And Sheila and her organisation would have been instrumental in myself and Timmy's desistance journey, So myself and Sheila are involved in training the new recruit prison officers. And the other old school officers, a lot of them have either retired or they've been offered early redundancy, early retirement. So the new school of officer, the profile of the officer is way different. They're viewed now as like you're there for more than opening and closing doors. You know, like if I'm working in an NGO or a charity, I might get into the prison for an hour or two in the week. The officer is on the landing all the time. The officer can be the point of contact. He can be the signpost for services. He can be the one that sparks the change, that plants the seed. So what they're looking at now is the prison service as yes, it is a prison service, but there's nothing to say that it can't be a social care setting, it can't be a youth work setting, it can't be a community work setting, and so the officers, and I was in prison there a couple of weeks ago teaching a class, and the prisoners said to me, they said that the new officers, they're a lot nicer, they're a lot more open, they're a lot more understanding, and they're a lot more conversational and a lot more. So that's great, because what we try to do with the training is to let the officers, before they start the job, they have an understanding that it's not black and white. Not all the good people are outside and all the bad people are inside. It's not like that at all. Some of the most, as we've already said, some of the people in this prison are victims. And in Ireland, we have a very poor mental health system. And the prison then is populated with people related to mental health and drug addiction. Like, these people aren't criminals at all, but we've nothing else to do with them, so they end up in prisons, So I suppose that's the prison services doing that. At least they're trying to address the issue. They're trying to create a better environment. They're trying to support people. Like me and Timmy have been invited into the prison to do podcasts for prisoners. They show our podcast, they stream our podcast from YouTube in the prisons, which is great. That's very forward. Because years ago you wouldn't be dreaming of that. That would never happen. So that's there. Then the recruitment with the Gardaí, our local or national police service called Garda. So the Gardaí are recruiting at the moment, and they are proactively looking for more diverse applicants, So people from ethnic minorities and people from, working class areas like myself. So the Garda at the moment is not reflective of society. It's kind of your father was a guard, so you become a guard, or it's like me and Timmy wouldn't have any guards from our local area. Do you know what I mean? Like, and you wouldn't have any traveller guard or Polish. We'd be Polish community in Cork, in Ireland. Huge Polish community. So the Guard is actively trying to get more diversity into the force. So there is positive things happening. But we've a long way to go.
But nonetheless, as you noted, some positive things happening. Sounds like Irish prison system moving in the right direction. Timmy, somewhat related to that question, again, broadly speaking, what works in our current approaches to addiction and addictive behavior? And conversely, what are we totally missing the boat on?
What works, I suppose, what works really is when we have people in prisons and they're actually away from alcohol and drugs, and they're able to look back in their lives and understand some of the choices that they've made around alcohol and drugs were wrong, and they're able to realise that they may have a problem with alcohol or drugs or gambling or whatever it may be. When they leave the prison setting and they're showing in prison that they really, really want to change and they want to make an effort, and there's nothing there for them. There's no, like, we have some services here in Ireland, as James mentioned a while ago, we have the Cork Alliance. But other than that, we have nothing. For example, if Timmy 7 years ago was leaving the prison setting, okay, and I had all intentions of going on and continuing my rehabilitation, around alcohol and drugs and everything else, and I was going into my natural environment, the same environment I was in before prison, and I'm going in where my brothers are still selling heroin or crack, and there's a lot of drugs in the family, the home, and there's violence coming, there's guards baiting in the door, there's people shooting at the house, there's people kicking in the back doors, kicking in the windows. I'm definitely going back on the drugs, like, definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, because I need to be able to medicate myself to get through that, because that will bring me back into a hypervigilant state where I need to to watch my back. What we need residential care facilities for people coming from prisons, and they can continue their rehabilitation outside of the prison setting. That is critical to the change that we have, because you have to understand a lot of the people that are in prison are coming from socially deprived areas where there's a lot of alcohol addiction, drug addiction, violence, drug dealing, crime, and we're taking them from prison setting and we're putting them back in to the same place expecting a different result. It's never going to happen, but you do occasionally get the one fella who is really, really adamant that he's going to change his life and continue on his recovery, and he'll get out of the family home, and he might go into, like James. James went into a facility where it was shared accommodation for people that had nowhere to live when they came out of prison, and he needed that because he knew that was his route to getting into the life that he really wanted for himself. So that's where we're lacking. That's where I think we're lacking, Joe.
James, you just mentioned some of the more enlightened hiring practices going on over there in Ireland. What advice would you give to either a prison official or a probation officer who's just entering the field today? Maybe something that they're not going to learn in the official manual, but a piece of advice that you would give to a probation officer, a correction officer, week one on the job.
If you're getting into it to punish people, or if you're getting into it because you have resentment with people that commit crime, it's not the job for you, because you will be miserable in that life, in that career of negativity. Like a corrections officer, as you call them in America. If you're involved in corrections, you should be there because you want to help people come out of it. In community work, I'm involved in community work, and the mantra we have in community work is you have to be working with the ultimate goal to make yourself redundant. And if you're not redundant, if you're not trying to make yourself redundant, means you're not in there for the right reason. So, obviously, I don't want anybody accessing my service, because if nobody accesses my service, that means that we've solved the drug problem in Ireland. You know what I mean? But realistically, that's not going to happen. But we still try. We still try. And if you're working as a probation officer, your ultimate goal is to make sure people don't come in the door to you again. Not to punish people, but to help people to move out of that offending behaviour. And that's not soft on crime, to help a prisoner or to help somebody that's committed a crime. That's not soft on crime. That's actually smart on crime. Because if you're tough, and what no better example for it than America, tough on crime, 3 strikes, war on drugs. Where did that get us? It doesn't, and even for me and Timmy, drugs are the risk of courts, convictions, and prison. That's not a deterrent for people. The threat of prison is not a deterrent for people. So you have to figure out other ways. And I understand that sometimes people do things and they have to go to prison. I can accept that, and I know maybe Angela Davis or other abolitionists might, crucify me for saying that, but I don't know, is there any alternative for housing, some people, but at the same time, everybody has the capacity to change, and everybody has the capacity to redeem themselves. And if you're working in the area of corrections, you should be a tool that they could use so that they move out of that, go into their communities, and make sure the next generation don't follow in their path, because that's what corrections should be. Go back and correct the wrongs that you've made.
I could not agree more. I want to pose this final question to each of you. What is on the horizon, say, for Timmy Long and or your work with the Two Norries podcast? Tim, if I got you back on the show in, say 3 years, what do you envision that we may be talking about in the future?
Probably my net worth, how much money I'm worth.
That's what we call an approach goal. I love it.
Maybe no. I'm only kidding, Joe. It's really all the most important thing in my life, coming from where I came from, really is the bit of peace I have with my head and my mental health. and how I'm able to cope with each day and be my best self really at the moment. But in 3 years' time, where would I like to see us? I'd like to see myself having a really structured life. I'd like to see the podcast reaching more people, so more people can get the help they require and badly need. Particularly after COVID, so many people are struggling with different issues. I'd like to be living on a farm in the countryside. That's my dream as well. I'd like to be living in a little farm. Not something extravagant, something just quite simple, something that I can fix up myself with my own hands, and just that everybody around me is happy and everybody's safe. That's and these wars that we're going through at the moment, these fucking mad things that are happening within in the world, that they're all stopped and more people just wake up, more people in power just wake up from that madness that's going on inside in their heads, and they just see the beauty of life and what we can really do to change the world instead of just making it a worse place. So
I love it. I absolutely love it. James, same question. And if you're on the show in 3 years, or if I'm over in Dublin and I bump into you, what do you think we might be chatting about?
In terms of the podcast, I wish for me and Timmy to be able to do it full time. Mm-hmm. At the moment, myself and Timmy work full time in busy jobs with lots of responsibility. And the podcast, as you know, Joe, it's not a walk in the park. You have to recruit guests, you have to research, you have to do the social media, you have to emails, editing, all these. It's hard work to do something every week, So, but we do that in our spare time. But I'd love to get to it because we're working. We can only do a certain amount, and we can only help a certain amount of people and cover a certain amount of topics with the time we have. If we were able to get funded through some philanthropist or some state body that would see the value of what we're doing and say, right, lads, here's an amount of funding. I want you to concentrate on it full time. Imagine the amount of people we could reach then, And what we get requests to do, to go to schools, to go to community projects, to go to NGOs, charities, to do talks, workshops, all these. But we actually can't because there's only so many hours in the day. We've got jobs, we've got podcasts, we've got families, kids, dogs, bills. So I'd love if we could do it full time, and that would be our job, to go around and help prisoners, help people in addiction, help family members connected to all that, and share and grow the podcast. And then personally, I just want to be happy, Joe, and that's if I'm not happy and well in myself, it doesn't matter what I'm doing at work or the podcast or anything. It all comes down to when you're in addiction and you're in prison. That's a very low point in your life. When you're in that stage, all you want is a bit of stability and a bit of contentment, and what Timmy said, a bit of peace of mind. And when you have that then in recovery, you have to protect that and make sure that all this other stuff doesn't interfere with it, because you take the eye off the ball and before you know it, the stakes are high, for people like myself and Timmy that have redeemed themselves, and now we have status in our communities and in our country, and we're respected. But any slip, the stakes are very high. Do you know what I mean? Because any slip is they just never got caught all that time, but they didn't really change. So it's just make sure that the recovery is good, the assistance is going well, you're happy and you're content, and then anything outside of that then is bonus.
What I really appreciated, and I heard this in each of your responses, particularly when you spoke about your podcast, was it wasn't about we want our podcast to take off so we can quit our day jobs and be rich. It was we want our podcast to take off so we can reach more people and help more people. So again, I really appreciated that. That sense of generativity, or you still have this passion to give back, even if it's through your very creative vehicle of the podcast, the Two Norries, which again, I will leave a link to your first episode so people can subscribe and get all caught up. Timmy Long, James Leonard of the Two Norries podcast from Cork, Ireland. I want to thank you so much for being on the show, my 100th episode. I couldn't think of two more people I'd rather have on for my centennial program.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much. And congratulations on the 100th podcast. Congratulations. That's amazing. Well done.
Thank you, Timmy. I appreciate it. We'll talk to you both very soon, I hope.
Bye.
God bless.
A big criminologist thank you to both Timothy Long and James Leonard, producers and host of the Two Norries podcast. I encourage you all to check it out and subscribe. Again, I'm going to leave a link for their initial episode in the program description of this podcast, so you can just click on that and check them out. Lots and lots of good stuff to learn from those two gentlemen. Say, as mentioned, this is episode number 100, and I wanted to thank a couple of people behind the scenes who you are made aware of every week because of their hard work. Thomas Saunders is my musical producer. You're hearing Thomas play now. He also does the musical intro to kick off the show. Thank you very much, Thomas, for all the work you do. And I also want to thank my daughter, Alyssa. Alyssa is my announcer. You hear her lovely voice each and every episode, kicking off and welcoming you to the show, as well as wrapping up the show in its conclusion. Thank you, Alyssa. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. Going to be bringing you part 2 of our series on self-regulation with Dr. Jared Brown of Concordia University. The more we find out about self-regulation deficits, we know how important it is to learn about that and address that. So please check out episode 101 next time with Dr. Jared Brown, speaking of self-regulation. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices, implementation, program design, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email of thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on Twitter. The Criminologist Media Group can be found at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow on Twitter. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this program. Hey, merchandise is available. Reach out if interested. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
And in the Chris, sorry, no, because my dogs are there joining. I'm just going to put them out. Hey, oh. You call them. I knew there was a chance that could happen. If I close the door, I won't get the Wi-Fi. So they're downstairs now, but you can cut that out afterwards, Joe.
Wow.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.